Freud was no dummy when he pointed to the fact that the devouring mother was one of the major impediments to proper human development. He knew that, looking deep into the darkest families and seeing this proclivity of the overprotective mother to destroy the developing integrity of the child, to keep the child infantile, to cling to that relationship instead of developing a life for herself and letting the child go flourish. That's Hansel and Gretel, right? You're lost in the woods. Why? Well, your family's broken up. And you have an evil stepmother. So now you're lost in the woods. What's your abuse rate if you have a step-parent? 100 times normal. So you're lost in the woods. Well, what happens? Well, you come across a gingerbread house. Well, that's pretty damn convenient. You need a house. It's more than you could even hope for. It's not just a house. It's a house made out of candy. Well, what's inside a house made out of candy? A witch who wants to fatten you up and eat you. And that's the devouring mother, and that's an old fairy tale. Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, and so, we could dwell on that for a minute too. One of the things we won't honestly discuss in our society, one of many, is the fundamental nature of female political psychopathology. And there's male political psychopathology, obviously. That's what the feminists complain about all the time when they talk about the oppressive patriarchy, toxic masculinity. There's no shortage of toxic masculinity. So is there any toxic femininity? Well, not if the feminine is just the, oppressed virgin goddess whose nature, but how about we don't live in that fantasy world? And we know, there's female political pathology, the tendency to infantilize everyone, and the tendency to assume that everyone who doesn't go along with the infantilization is properly characterized as a predator. And so, you wonder, why are the universities turning into extended daycares? Well, a lot of the reason for that is that women who don't have anything better to do are turning the university students into the infants they never had. So,
Jesus.
So I don't know when we'll be able to be mature enough to have that conversation. 20 years from now.
What is a path to bring this back to some sort of rational, logical way of discussing these problems?
So I tweeted out, I don't know if you saw this, that I was going to make an announcement on your show today. And so I set up an international consortium based in London. I can't tell you all the details yet, but we're trying to put together something like an alternative vision of the future, say an alternative to that kind of apocalyptic narrative that's being put forward, at least implicitly, by organizations like the WEF, and that's the virginal planet, rapacious tyrant, all-devouring consumer religion. And it's more like something like, well, we want to ask people 6 key questions. Okay, so how do we get energy and resources at the lowest possible cost, as rapidly as possible, to the largest number of people around the world? That's one question. And so there's a presumption in the question, and here's one of the presumptions. You don't get to save the planet by making energy prices so expensive that no one poor can afford them. That's off the table. So if you want to develop alternative energy sources, no problem. Because, hey man, the more energy sources we have, the better. But you don't get to impose your utopian vision in the service of your narcissism on the poor. We're going to try to make the poor rich. Going to try to alleviate absolute poverty. Pro-human view. On environmental stewardship front, that's the next question. What are the major problems that are confronting us? How do we take a sophisticated, multidimensional view of that? How do we prioritize our attempts to establish our states and our international relationships properly so that we prioritize human well-being, in harmony with nature to the degree that's possible, but human-focused and not predicated on the idea that there are too many goddamn mouths on the planet to feed and that you're evil if you just think about having children. So then on the governance front, this is where it gets kind of more left-wing, I would say, is none of the people involved in this consortium so far are very thrilled with global corporate fascist government media and corporation collusion. And we're seeing this at the high end. It's like a Tower of Babel, is that the powerful players in the world are increasingly collaborating to impose a top-down vision of the future on everyone. And that's a future that's predicated on a zero growth model. And the idea that, well, we'd need 5 planets really to support everyone at the current standard of living that obtains in the West. So the best pathway forward is to deny loans by the World Bank to developing countries so they can't develop, energy sources, which all that'll mean is they're going to burn wood and coal, obviously. So that's the third question is, how do we arrange systems of governance to stop the march of something like pathological gigantism? This is why I like people like Russell Brand and also you to some degree politically, because you guys are very, what would you say, sensitive to the danger of that kind of corrupt collusion, that regulatory capture that occurs when corporate entities and media entities and governmental entities are all in bed together, like the FDA and the CDC and so forth and so on without end. So that's the third question. The fourth question is, what do we put forward as a vision on the family policy front to facilitate the, what would you call it, the encouragement and the maintenance of long-term monogamous couples who are child-centered, and to make increasing the birth rate part of that policy, to put policies in place that would support long-term stable monogamous families, two-parent families, and child-centered. Because in the West, because we're very immature, we think that the purpose of a marriage is the happiness of the people who are involved in the marriage, the husband and the wife. And that's just not the purpose of marriage at all. The purpose is long-term facilitation of their psychological and spiritual development and the establishment of an environment that's beneficial to children. That's a responsible way of thinking about it. And so we need to have a serious conversation about what that means. And, it's tricky because, I think the ideal has to be long-term committed monogamous heterosexual relationships. And I had a big conversation about this with Dave Rubin. Rubin's gay and he's married, and him and his partner now have 2 infants, and we talked through how that was. It was a very hard thing for them to arrange, obviously. Why? Well, they're both male. So that poses a severe problem on the reproductive front, right? And so they managed that, and they have 2 infants, but it's very complex, and it's obviously not a solution to the problem of relationship and reproduction that's duplicatable across large numbers of people. It just takes too many resources. Now, I do think we have to have an ideal at the center of every concept, but the ideal can't be too rigid, because people aren't perfect. In my own family, there's lots of people who are divorced. In lots of people's families, there are people who are gay. There are lots of people in unhappy marriages. Nobody attains the ideal. So the ideal has to be surrounded by a fringe of tolerance, but that doesn't mean you sacrifice the ideal. And the ideal has to be, well, we know there's a literature on fatherlessness. It's a bloody catastrophe.